which we've looked at already, let's assume that's in place. If we look at the sort of more project and product level stuff, there are sort of 3 clusters of similar things, okay, and they explain a very large chunk of the outcomes. Not everything. You're not going to be 100% successful if you do them, and you're not going to be 100% unsuccessful if you don't do them, okay, but it's one of probabilities. Yeah, you're going to edge your way, nudge your way into success. Okay, and they reinforce each other. So in real life, they're one thing. For the sake of analysis and discussion, you separate them out. And you'll see how they relate to each other in a moment. So we'll unpack these 3 things. So we said earlier on, certain things aren't helpful. You know, saying what helps product success, product superiority is really unhelpful. Yeah, because it doesn't give us much new information to act on. So we need to unpack some of these things. Okay, product advantage. There are different dimensions of this. So different studies focus on different things. And what you find is basically, is very early on in product development, you need to do a thought experiment. So this is not, doesn't have to be a focus group and market research or big data or experiments at this stage. It's almost like a thought experiment. Okay, you have conceptualized, because it's very early on, something that does X, Y, and Z. Under what conditions would X, Y, and Z create value, and for whom? It's that sort of level. Yeah, and it makes you think about, oh, okay, it does this, but who would benefit from that, and would they be able to pay for it? Would we be able to reach them? And what are they using at the moment? So it's a thought experiment. And the reason it's so powerful early on, yeah, is because it makes you think about, okay, it does X, Y, and Z, but actually Z's not very important. Or X is really important, so let's focus on that. Or actually something's missing, you know, we need a V. Yeah? So early on you can play around with these things, but as they go through development, these things get baked in and are harder to change. Yeah? So these happen very early on. And then no thing will satisfy all these, but basically it's a checklist. Does it do any of these things? If not, you might want to review what it does. Yeah. Okay, so it's like a thought experiment early on. Unique benefit for customers. Well, unique's a bit strong, yeah, but it's, what's that another way of saying? What's a simpler way of saying that? It's basically differentiation, isn't it, in another term? It's basically saying, what does it do that's different? Unique's a bit strong, but different's a better term. Yeah, what does it do, and for whom? So it also makes you think about who the target segment is, which is another one of the disciplines. Yeah, who would use it for what purpose? How would it create value for them? How could we reach more people? How could it create more value? Yeah, those things can be done early on, and then they get baked in. You can't change it. Relative perceived quality, I think in the very first session we briefly discussed the PIMS database, if you remember that. Yeah, there's quite a strong positive association between relative perceived quality measured in certain ways and things like growth and market share. Relative perceived superiority, so this is closer to Bob Cooper's work, looking at superiority of products, and it's slightly different. I mean, you could argue differentiation is like a vertical differentiation, but it gets a bit silly. So differentiation tends to be conceived of the sort of horizontal attribute. Superiority is a more hierarchical one. You know, if you identify a target group of potential users or buyers, and you give them 5 products, and you say, well, rank these in order of superiority. And if you've got your segmentation right, they'll rank very similarly. Often they don't know why, and it's interesting to figure out what, you know, is it advertising, is it experience, is it peer pressure, and that's sort of thing we discuss when we look at diffusion later in the module. Yeah, but certainly you get consistency. So there's something going on there that's not just about differentiation. Yeah? It's different. Reduce life cycle cost to customer. There's a mouthful. Why is that different to price? Because if you do marketing, I'm not going to ask you an awkward question, or I might do. Who's done marketing before? Just raise your hands. Very small number actually, quite, you know, probably 6 or 7. I'll speak a bit slower for you guys then. Okay, so if you've done marketing, you have things like the 3 Ps and the 4 Ps and the 7 Ps and all that nonsense. As many Ps as you can possibly eat, yeah? And one of the Ps is usually price. Sometimes price point, you've got 2 Ps, the price of 1, yeah? Okay, so price is often not discretionary, but you know, you have a cost base, and even that you can go below if you're going to ramp up volume learning curve. So price is surprisingly sort of malleable in terms of who you want to reach and how you want to do it. It sends signals about quality. Price is different to reduce life cycle cost of customer. Yeah, it's different, and it's more important for innovation and product development than price. Because you can build something against a price, and some companies do. It's usually a bad mistake. So they say, what's the price point? We'll have a margin of 20% and therefore the target cost is X. It's a really dumb way of doing things, but companies do that. It's really, really dumb. The reduced life cycle cost to customer, which is very hard to say, is more important. But let's figure out what it is first. Why is that different to price?
Predict when people buy again. So what value is over time?
That's the thing, yeah, exactly that. Over time. One of my favourite things, when we're talking about time-based variation, time, without getting too sort of metaphysical, is really, really important, and we often ignore it, particularly in things like marketing. It tends to be static cross-sectional segments and things. So certainly, it takes into account time. And what do we mean by that? Well, if it's a car, it's cost of ownership over that period. Yeah. If it's a degree, it's how long you're going to be around here. Often longer than you like. Yeah. And so on. So it's different, but why is it important for product development, or product and service development, particularly service development? So certainly it's different because of that time factor. It's not a sort of, when people say a price point, they mean in space, not time. But price point is sort of one thing. I paid X for that, which may be very different to somebody else. Well, that's one thing. It is important because it sends signals and such like. But this is different. The reason it's important for product and service development is it gives you more degrees of freedom about what you develop and how. Okay. Stupid example. If you do price point and product development, like a lot of the car companies do, they say, okay, here's a segment, C segment, for example, a certain type of car. The price range in that market for that car is A to B price point, and typically our products are mid-price point or low price point. That's our target price point. Our typical margins are manufactured at 15%. That's our cost target at this volume. Yeah, and they're literally like that. They have a hierarchy, and then they go to the engineering guys and go, you need to produce 250,000 products a year, no more than that target cost point, because we want the margin, blah, blah, blah. Now, ignore all the problems of forecasting and errors, which we'll talk about in another session when we look at forecasting. Just assume they know the volume, yeah? That's by the by. And then what the engineers do is say, okay, how do we redesign it? It's called value engineering, yeah? It's a bit misnomer, it's actually cost engineering. But basically it says, this is what they've given us as a cost target, and within that envelope, how can we serve that market, yeah? And they do lots of different ways, different materials, substitute materials, eliminate materials, inferior materials, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, and they get it down to sort of value engineering, okay? Literally down to grommets and screws and interfaces. Reduced life cycle cost to customer doesn't quite invert that, but changes the logic. And the logic is, if you like, for the target group, and we'll come to that in a moment, what's the typical lifetime? Is it an instant consumption? Is it months, years, days, decades? Yeah. So if you take cars as an example, in the UK, it's 2 to 3 years. It's slightly getting longer as people are hanging on to stuff, apart from diesels, which are sort of moving like the plague. But generally, companies and individuals hanging on to roughly, it used to be 2.5, it's about 3 years now, roughly. So for that target segment, you say, okay, 3 years is the cost of ownership. What are the key costs over that 3-year period? Not price, not what's the ticket. We haven't mentioned the ticket price yet. What is the main cost? And obviously there's ticket price, there's financing if they go on a lease deal, there's servicing costs, servicing intervals, and the main thing over 3 years are residues. What's it worth after 3 years? If you sell it back to the dealer or you sell it privately, and you calculate all those things, you find out the actual price paid is largely irrelevant. And that's not the only industry. The bigger the purchase price in the longer period, the more degrees of freedom you've got. So once you've got that as a development team, you've got a much broader brief. So rather than value engineer and say, who's the cheapest manufacturer of windscreen motors? Yeah? You say, okay, what windscreen motors would reduce our servicing costs over 3 years? And you might actually choose more robust ones that would have 0 interval costs, yeah? Or would increase the residue value because they're still running, yeah? You see the idea, different logics, you end up with very different product trade-offs, okay? Very different ones. So not in everything, but in many areas of products and services, reduce life cycle cost to customer, once you figure out who the target customers are and how long they're, opens up more degrees of freedom. You can do things differently, which is what a lot of innovation is about, yeah? Okay. And the last one is the cookie jar, the cookie thing. Solution to customers' problem, okay, yeah. But that begs you getting that deep knowledge of what customers do. So it's things like ethnographic, watching others, the sort of things user innovation that we discussed last week, yeah. And that's fine, but it's quite resource intensive. So our answer is, if you can't tick any of these, then you need to regroup very early on and say, what, maybe it doesn't have any value, it's just novel. So you might need to play around with it, or terminate it, or shelve it, or sell it as IP or something. Yeah. Okay, so like a checklist. A technique, a tool that's very powerful to do that, and I think a few of the groups we touched upon this very briefly in the seminars in week 2 or whatever it was, week 1. Quality function deployment is simply a structured way of trying to explore some of those product advantages. Yeah. So things like the life cycle cost to customer, perceived superiority, differentiation, those sort of things. Actually trying to put some sort of structure on that to get functional groups to discuss and debate and compromise and experiment. That's all it's trying to do. Okay, so it's one of those visual techniques, a bit like spider diagrams, ladders and things like that, that allow groups to interact, okay, and to have to articulate what their assumptions are and to have a debate. Yeah, if we do that, we can't do that. If we do that, what are the implications? Yeah, and you begin to get that iteration and you get that experimentation very early on. Very powerful technique. At its core, it's very simple, but it can be what's the expression? It can become very complex very quickly. Yeah, but at its core, it's a simple matrix, qualitative matrix. But I've seen it done over 5-6 days. So it can get very, locking people in a hotel room until they get an answer. But you can do it in an afternoon, quick and dirty sort of thing. So what it does is basically, as you'd expect, to try to identify potential users. You're trying to figure out who they are, because a lot of this flows from the target market. Once you've done that, and only when you've done that, can you say, well, what's important? To that target segment, what is important? And sometimes you can only rank it, that's more important than that. Sometimes you can weight it, you can put numbers on or symbols to try to say, well, actually, these are equally important, yeah, depending on how good your data is and how radical the product is. And then you can try to put some metrics on it, which can be ideally numerical, but often they're just symbolic, yeah. So the relationship could be very, not at all, yeah, weak, a simple sort of Likert scale of 3 sort of thing. And then you try, correlation's a bit strong. So you can do it numerically, and you can correlate it mathematically, but often it's symbols saying, well, if we do that, what does it do to the cost of ownership over 3 years, yeah? Or if we do that, what does it do to relative perceived superiority? And then you try to sort of get a group of things for that target group that's the best compromise out of that. And you also look at what's currently available. It's a very, very powerful technique because it's graphical, forces different functional groups to get together and then to articulate and debate those differences. Yeah, very powerful technique. At its simplest, that's what it looks like. Okay, as I say, it's sort of not iterative. That's going in circles. Recursive. That's a better word, isn't it? Yeah, recursive. So it can go up and down. You can go deeper and deeper and deeper, or you can go higher and higher level. Yeah, a bit like laddering. Okay, so you start at a certain level and say, actually, we need to go down a level and look at this core component, or we need to go up a level and look at the service experience around the product. Yeah, so you can go up and down and figure out where the action is. But at its core, it's a way of visually articulating what are the relationships between, if you like, what we can do, the horizontal, and what is desired on the vertical, and what are the relationships between those types of constraints. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Great technique, actually. Okay. So that was the first one. Product advantage. Okay. In reality, they all interact, as you'll see in a moment, but we're unpacking them, looking at what works in each of the 3 boxes. So the first one, product advantage. Second one, target market, which we've already begun to discuss, because for things like QFD to work, and for things like, what are the product advantages, they're all relative to the target segment. There are almost no universal benefits for a product or service, very rare indeed. Okay, so normally you're tailoring or customizing for a particular target group. And as we saw from the Cooper work and also to the Stanford work, and many of the studies since then, this is a terribly important thing to do early on, to sharpen up the definition of the concept. This does not mean that later on you don't refine that, you don't experiment, you don't even ultimately, in the terminology of 2 or 3 years ago, pivot, which means you change at the last moment or after you've launched. Basically, you make a mistake and you learn from it. Yeah, you pivot, change direction. It doesn't mean you don't change it and you don't test it. But it means early on you start with an agreement on who's this targeted at. And the reason that's so important, because it then sharpens your thoughts about how do we optimize the benefits and the value for that group. Yeah, because otherwise you're just playing around with features and benefits in abstract. Okay. So Basis segmentation, I know a dozen of you have done some marketing. So for those who've done some marketing, how would you define segmentation? Yeah. Yeah, how do you define market segmentation? Yeah, grouping, okay, that's good enough. Yeah, basically you're grouping potential, sometimes it's buyers, sometimes it's users, depending on how the market's structured, but users we'll call them. Potential users, actually it's buyers more often, on some sort of basis. Yeah, and the idea is that you group them because for the purpose of that product and service, their buying requirements are similar, sufficiently similar. Yeah, so you're not saying you're all the same people, but you're saying for the purpose of this decision, do I buy or use this product or service, your interests are sufficiently similar that we can put you together. So a segment is literally a subset, a group around that. Okay, so it's not the whole market and it's not an individual, it's somewhere in between the two. And sometimes you can do that statistically. If it's a sort of product extension, you've got data on these things. If it's more radical, it's more qualitative. Yeah, so you would segment on basis of things like demographics, education, earnings, culture, location, hobbies, things like that. Yeah, okay. And basically what you're trying to do is well, three things. Firstly, you're trying to say what is the sort of group of things that you've got to have to play the game. Yeah. So whether it's a car, a smartphone, a university program, what are the must-haves for that target group? Non-negotiable, we've got to have them. They won't differentiate, yeah, but if we don't have them, people will not come. Yeah. And then above and beyond that, that prior list of product advantage. For that target group, what in addition do we offer that will help differentiate that offering? Is it superiority? Is it differentiation? Is it reduced life cycle cost, etc., etc. Yeah? And then finally, once you've done all that, then you can do the numbers and say, is it viable? Because it might be a great product or service that really fulfills the needs of 5 people globally. Yeah, so unless it's space travel, you're probably not going to have a viable business model. Yeah. So then there's often another iteration or two where you say, okay, if we expand the segment slightly, or we increase the value offering, do we reach more people or a different segment? Yeah, and you have a few iterations. So it's experimental, like a what if thing. Yeah. Okay. But if you don't do it early on, yeah, you have no idea of what products and benefits and features that you're trying to improve upon. You will then test those and experiment and ultimately pivot and change, but you've got to change and pivot from some base, yeah, rather than just carry on like that. It's very powerful. Okay, example segmentation. This is one Talk did about 5 years ago. I'm basically saying, why do people basically purchase different types of cell phone when they're basically the same? So if you control for a price point, which you should do, people are dumb enough to spend, I don't know, $50 a month on a cell phone contract, then why do they buy that product rather than that one, rather than that one? Okay, and then you interview people, you do focus groups, try to differentiate, and you can begin to cluster people around. Well, actually, these things are more important to these people, okay, whereas these other things are more important to that segment. Yeah, and such is life. Okay, so the ways of trying to understand, some of them are demographic, and some are more about what sort of needs and use that they have. Okay. Remember BlackBerry? Those were the days. Okay, and the final of the third, yeah, so product advantage, target market, which are interlinked, and the last one is pre-development, a underlined, highlight a pen, everything you can do. Really, really early on stuff. So this is not, let's do some market research and have another meeting and the committee will decide it and blah, blah, blah. Test it in the marketplace, that all happens later. This is very early on because that's what the research tells us is important. Yeah? But we've already discussed that's not what we manage. We manage the stuff that's consuming resources much later on, which has only a marginal effect. Yeah, so we need to put some of that effort in trying to manage the early fuzzy front end, as they call it in product development. Okay? So there are initial screens about, does it fit? Fit with what? Fit with what? What would your filter be in terms of fit? So one of the very earliest filters you'll apply to a product or service concept is, does it fit?
Does it fit with the kind of overall strategy of the firm, of the organisation?
Yeah, so one would be, like a few weeks ago, looking at the strategic direction, does it fit? Or does it actually sort of distract us or distract customers from that direction of travel? And that's a legitimate question. Well, it's often very qualitative, but you could often very easily make that decision. So no, that would not fit our direction of travel. Yeah. So one is that one of strategic direction, which we've discussed. Yeah, that's a big deal. Any other ones that you might want to consider? Types of fit. Yeah, fit in the sense of can we do it, or could we do it? Not necessarily immediately do it, but could it be done by us in some sort of way? Which is just, certainly the capability argument is another filter we can apply. And what's the third one? There's probably more than. Customer links, which is really a subset again of that universal management diagram, in this, as we call it now. In the sense is product portfolio. Does it fit in the sense that is it too close to existing products and services and you'll get competition with yourself, cannibalization, redundancy, literally, or is it so far away that we can't really service and support it economically? It's a great product, but it's laying out there and we have nothing else out there. And you get that sort of curvilinear relationship, seriously. So one is a more portfolio fit, which is more at the product and service level than it is at the capability level, the strategic level. But all of those are relevant. And often you can answer them really quickly. If you've got any experience in an organisation, you don't need days of evaluation, clever type techniques. It's often you think, well, no. It's a great, and it's frustrating because you often get lots of things proposed and you think, no. And that's why you have things like corporate venturing and spin-outs and things we'll talk about later in another part of the module. Okay, and then once you've figured out the fit and the scope of the project, then you can do the sort of more mechanical stuff. And sometimes it's just an Excel spreadsheet, and sometimes it's an internal format or pro forma that you've got to go through the motions. And it will say do not go, do not pass go, do not collect 200, or it will say try again, or the internal rate of return is too low, or blah 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 blah. Yes, it's a more mechanical one, and you can play around with that. And so the better systems are not go no go, but they're iterative. Let's say things like market not big enough or profit margin not big enough, and you go back and say, is it reasonable to change the target segment to, and you can play around with these things to make it. And then you can do the financial stuff and say, given cost of capital, will it work, blah, 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 blah. Okay. But these are done very early on. They will change, yes, they will change. We know that, but they've got to change from something, So you start with something which allows you then to focus on certain things to create value, Okay. Forecasting we'll spend a whole session on in 2 or 3 weeks' time, whenever it is. Towards the end, I seem to remember. But there are certain things, if you like, are easier to forecast than other things, And it's not what you quite might think. So if you look at studies, you tend to find that most development teams are quite comfortable with predicting development costs and time, partly because project management is fairly well developed discipline, and once you have a project, it tends to be managed quite closely. Technical success, often they do a lot of background work upon can it be done, can we do it, sort of technical milestones. Okay, so those sort of things rarely trip you up. They can do. It tends to be the more sort of external market things that trip you up in these sort of things. That you get often orders of magnitude errors in sales. Either they're too small, or equally punishing, they're potentially too big and you can't serve the market, which at the very least is embarrassing, and at most you can lose to competitors. And also the life cycle question. Is it 1, 2, 3? How quickly is the replacement cycle? And you sort of underestimate often the speed of replacement because competitors come in and then you have to regroup and such like. So not all things are sort of equally forecastable, but we'll spend a whole session looking at those sorts of stuff. Okay, in terms of project screening, we've had fit, and then we try to get some things that are slightly more quantitative. So the more qualitative ones have already been done. Does it fit? Is it in our direction of travel, strategic travel? Does it fit our capabilities? Okay, where does it sit in the product portfolio? Is it too close, too far, etc., etc. And then you can get some sort of more measurement-based attempts on trying to filter these out. These aren't mechanical in the sense that if you foul them, you don't go forward, or if you pass them, you go forward. I mean, they're not usually automated. They're normally guides to management discretion. So an input to a decision. They're not a decision in itself. Otherwise, you just stick it online and let people play around with themselves. Okay. So sometimes you will, thing that doesn't add up quite right would have a strong strategic case to go ahead. Or conversely, something that passes all the tests just doesn't seem to work. For us. Okay, so don't worry about that. Okay, no particular order. So typical, these are ones, this study looked at 50 projects, development projects. It's not a huge study, but actually looked at them, went into the companies. And we looked at 2 things. Do they use the things? And if they use them, are they any good? Are they any use? And then the other thing we looked at is the more radical projects and the more product extension routine stuff. Are there any differences in use? Blah, blah, blah. I won't go through the whole matrix of stuff, but it was interesting that certain things are used very commonly. So probability of success, technical and commercial separately. Market share estimates are almost universally used, yeah? If you look at the studies. Capability assessment, which is your point there, is usually there, and it's something that's used more for the high novelty radical projects than it is the others. Potential market size, very important. Total commitment, team commitment, yeah, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, so the only ones there that differentiate between the high novelty and the low novelty are the relevance to market share and capability fit on that. Oh, and payback period. Okay. In terms of a process, there are basically two, I don't want to be rude or anything, two types of variation of theme. So if you go into companies and you say, do you have a process for product development, I would guarantee money back is going to be one of these two flavors. They might call it something else, but when you look at it, it'll be one of these two variation of theme. The most common one is the so-called stage gate model. Stage gate model you hear a lot about when you go out there. Yeah, consultants often call it different things, but when you look at it and what it does, it's a stage gate. Yeah? Stage gate came from Robert Cooper's work, based mainly on consumer type products around the business, but it sort of travels quite well. Stage gate because there are stages, things you have to do, discrete parts you have to do, and between each stage there is a gate. And a gate can be automatic. If you fulfill this milestone, you go to the next stage. But usually there's some intervention. It could be a committee, it could be an individual manager, it could be a presentation, a pitch. Yeah. So usually at the gate there is something other than an automatic go no go. Yeah. So each gate's different. Some can be simple, an individual, the manager has to agree it, approve it. It could be a committee, it could be a pitch, it could be all different things. Yeah. But basically the stages and then gates between them. Points at which decisions are made. Go, no go, or go back and revise. Yeah? Basically the three options. Yeah? And how many gates you have is dependent on the nature of the project. I mean, what type of thing might affect the number of stages and gates? Because it can be really simple. You could have just two. Having one wouldn't make much sense. You could have two, and I've seen companies with two, and I've seen companies with 18. Yeah? I mean, what factors there's at least a couple of factors that influence the number of stages and gates you might have. The principle's the same, but the reality is different.
Whether it has to satisfy lots of kind of safety precautionary requirements like the pharmaceutical industry, maybe.
Yeah. Regulatory, where there are regulatory either requirements or prescriptions. So in pharmaceuticals, if I pardon the pun, prescriptions. They're prescribed points that you've got to do. Others, it's more regulatory. How you do it is up to you, but you still got to do it at certain points. There might be a sort of health and safety check, another check, blah, blah, blah. So where there's some regulatory requirement or involvement, yeah, usually add some stages and gates into that. And the other one will be where there's issues of complexity. Often you will have to decompose a project, and at certain points you bring them together. And sometimes you have both, like pharmaceuticals, for example, okay, which is grief all around. But the basic principle is the same. Okay, so the gates are some simple, some not so simple, rarely automatic, and it's usually go, no go, or revise and review. Yeah, so a loop. Okay. That's the most common by a huge margin, whatever they call it. You know, the other one which you'll see a variation on is so-called development funnel. And they're different, and often they're combined, but usually stage gates are more common. And the main difference between the two is a development funnel explicitly builds in resource constraints. Yeah, so in theory, the stage gate, the previous one, could have a gate that says, do we have the resources to do it? And you say, well, that takes into account resource constraints. However, in a pure sense, you normally have a filter that says, does it have a positive net present value? And if the answer is yes, it goes on to the next one, because it's going to make money if you're right, all your assumptions. Yeah. So in theory, resource constraints are not necessary in a stage gate, because you could argue you can get the resources. Yeah, you can borrow money, issue shares, have a joint venture, license something. Yeah, if it's a good project, then there are often ways of getting the resources. So stage gate is not inherently resource constrained. In practice, it usually is. The development funnel starts off from the assumption that we only have the resources, money, time, talent, whatever, technology, to have X number of projects at this level. So one of the major filters is this idea of resource constraints. Okay, so in those sorts of sectors and size of company where resource constraints are the critical issue, you tend to start with the development funnel. Okay, where it's less of a constraint, a stage gate. Yeah? But they both basically do the same thing. There's a series of stages where decisions are made about what happens next. Termination, go through, or you revise and resubmit at that gate. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Blah blah blah. Okay. So a lot of that stuff's at the filter earlier stages, and then you sort of squirt it into the sort of implementation development stage. And I said earlier, a lot of management effort goes into that because you're consuming resource, people's time, money, equipment, machinery, and you need to manage that, and that's all good project management. But most of the things that are going to have an effect on success have been baked in already. Yeah. So you may get a crappy product on time. So what? Yeah. So it's important to manage the resources, sure, but you also need to manage that fuzzy front end. And what's left, really? Well, what's left after you've done those things? Once you've done that, you're 2/3 of the way there. Other things to look at. Most companies do some sort of assessment internally, so they do some filters about, is it working technically? Some market assessment before launch quite often. Occasionally, 2/3 of the companies roughly do some sort of customer tests, often a beta test with a friendly customer, and that's better than not doing it. But where most companies fail, they don't do it or they don't do it well or sufficiently, are the last two. And that's where you've got a more sort of real life testing and experimentation. So most companies don't have the time or the resource or the patience to actually trial and test these offerings before they scale up. Okay? Often there's a time imperative, a competitor or a piece of regulation or something like that. Okay? And that puts a lot of pressure on the team to simply run out of resources and they need to launch the thing. And we'll come back to that when we look at diffusion of innovations later in the module, because it's one of the problems, yeah? Is we put all this effort into getting the product or the service out and then whew, relax. And we don't do the last step just to refine the thing before we scale up, yeah, which could save so much grief later on. Okay. Formal process, blah 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 blah. Yeah, I mean most of the benefits of having a formal product development process, not the innovation one, are the latter two. Yeah, that you tend to, it helps with the project management, the target, and that. But really important, it also simultaneously helps with the success, the effectiveness. So it's partly efficiency, use of resources, partly effectiveness. And I said to you earlier, the early studies, Sappho, Stanford, identified that up to a point these things are synonymous. Yeah, they're not antagonistic. Yeah, and that's really important. Okay. Yeah, don't worry about that. Yeah, same study as before with the filters, 50 projects, looked at them, basically saying, okay, what types of different sort of tools and techniques are used and which ones are effective in different areas, and we're talking about some of these. Segmentation, again, was done very early on, prototyping later on, but the idea was twofold. One is there are a range of techniques we can actually put this into practice, and the effectiveness of those techniques varies between how radical the project is. Yeah? So some work better in other types of projects. I just want to end on one of the service slides. Yeah, I'm going to stop here. Okay, I keep using the terms products and services interchangeably. They're not the same. Most of the stuff that we know from 45 years of research works for manufactured products, also works for services, hand on heart. So the studies that replicate it suggest most of these factors are generic, they work in services. However, I think in addition, many services have a few other factors that may need to be managed. And there have been a small number of studies that try to identify what's different about services. So it seems like tangibility, expectations. Yeah. So how you develop services is slightly different in terms of the success factors. Many are the same. So a lot of it is about scalability, all these other things, operational improvement, brand differentiation, blah, 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 are largely very similar here. Okay, so there's not many differences. Study by Clayton